InnerQuest explores various pathways through which you can connect with the infinite wisdom of the universe and apply it to personal, professional, and spiritual growth. This program, featuring accomplished practitioners, educators, and authors, is provided by Infinity Foundation, an innovative center for holistic studies and research. We invite you to share this journey with us.
Hello, welcome to InnerQuest. My name is Jay Stone, and our guest today is Joe McQuillen. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
Good. We'd also like to thank Infinity Foundation for being the force behind this TV show, and you should check Infinity out. They have great classes. Let me tell the audience a little bit about you, Joe. Joe has been married for 27 years and is the father of 3 children. One of his sons, Christopher, is on the other side. The loss of his first born son, Chris, in a canoe accident on January 3rd, 2016, propelled him to search for his son, Chris, through medium, healers, psychics, and eventually channel writing. So we're going to discuss each of those individual techniques. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and your son, Chris, who's on the other side, before he made his transition.
Sure, Jay. Thanks. And I really appreciate being here. So I'm the youngest of 10 kids, blue-collar family from Buffalo, New York, and married, as you said, for 27 years. 3 kids, and never expected what is any parent's worst nightmare, which is in January 3rd of 2016, to lose one of my children, have my son drown in a canoe accident with 3 other new Trier graduates.
And many people
more
from this
information
show
about
goes out
this
to
show,
this
our
community,
guest,
and
Infinity
including Winnetka, so
Foundation,
many people from
or
this
any of our other
community
programs,
have heard about this
please
tragic
visit our
accident.
website.
Yeah, it's pretty well known in the North Shore and anywhere in Chicago.
Or call
Dua,
us at
a wonderful author for the Tribune, did a couple of great stories the year of it. And why I granted an interview the first year was that I wanted them to know who the kids were. You know, Chris was a precocious kid, wasn't a great student, a lovely boy, and at his wake, we had, just to give you an example, we had 2,000 people at his wake, and mostly, you know, friends and family. And
Where was the wake held at?
the wake was held right here in Skokie, Donlin family funeral parlor, and Grace Donlin was just amazing. She was the funeral director that held it there. It was raining. We kept it open for 2 additional hours so everybody could come through. And it was an amazing, you know, I feel like I was sleepwalking, but I just felt the amazing support of all his friends, his college friends, his local friends, family from all around the country and around the world, actually.
Yes, and your son was 21 when he passed?
21 years old. They were all from the same grade. They were all in college. They were home for a Christmas vacation, and it was...
Were they all New Trier students?
They were all originally New Trier students who then went on to
Different colleges. And your son was at Northern, was it?
He was at Northern Illinois University, yeah.
Okay. And then, but prior to that, your son had some difficulties or challenges in life?
Well, you know, Jay, I'm 33 years sober. So,
okay. So
he came by it genetically accurately. Yeah.
Recovering alcoholic, and we
That's
know
right.
there's a genetic
Of
component.
course, and if anybody doesn't know that, you know, please absorb it, get some research, because it is genetics. And you know, like with my kids, we just know that there's always a possibility more than normal. So just keep an eye on it. So we sent Christopher to In Balance Ranch Academy in Tucson. That specializes in drug and alcohol for teen boys. I'm now on the board of the charity board, and the family who owns it, the Barassos, are like family to us, and Chris was family to them.
And how long did he attend that school?
He attended the school for a year, and he stayed on as staff for another year. You know, so they asked him to stay on as they call him life coach, where the ranch is an hour and a half south of Tucson, And
It sounds similar to the AA program where once you get sober, you sponsor other people.
it's based on the 12 steps, which is what really
Okay.
brought me to wanting to send Chris there. It's based on 12 steps. So
And what were the ages, or what are the ages since you are on the board?
perfect. It's from 14
Okay.
up until 6 months prior to your 18th birthday. And why they don't want after 18th birthday is because you have the ability to sign yourself out at that point. So you actually give them custody for the period of time that they're there. So the kids can't just decide up and leave.
Like the guardianship?
Yes, yeah. So in balance, so he went to finish his high school degree there. He was taking classes. He was working there as a life coach. They've dedicated this year a brand new housing structure for student housing because the kids live there. It's an old dude ranch that they've turned into a school. So there's bunk houses and it looks like a chuck wagon but a wonderful education center. And they dedicated last year a fire pit where the kids do some of their step work and their spiritual work to Chris. And this year they built student housing, a new bunkhouse, and they call it McQuillen Manor after my boy.
That's great.
He's kind of a legend out there at this point.
Okay. Now, because of you're in recovery and doing
Yeah.
the 12, you had a spiritual practice keeping you alive and sober prior to this accident.
I got to tell you, that helped me so much when this happened. I had a spiritual awakening. I had a compulsion lifted. So I believe very much in a higher power. And when it's my habit every night to get on my knees and thank God for the day, keeping me sober for my family. And when Chris, right after he drowned, I would do that. But then I would say to him, but I'm PO'd at you for taking my son. And I did this. I wanted to acknowledge the higher power, but I also wanted to know that we're not on great terms right now. And about 3 or 4 days into this, I got a message subliminally. It just said, I didn't take your son. Your son's free will and recklessness caused him to come home early. And I welcomed him home, but I didn't take him, and I lost a son too. So at that point, I knew that it was God that was holding me up during this point in time. He didn't move my son around like a chess piece and take him from me.
Well, I didn't mention in the intro that you actually wrote a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to just say a few words about this book?
I never meant to write a book. I didn't do this to be an author. Because I wanted to know what happens next, and because if there was a way to stay in contact with my son's spirit, I wanted to figure it out. I touched base with a medium that I had known 15 years before and attended one visit with. And I started researching, I started reading, I started meditating, anything that would get me closer to him. And I was keeping copious notes. Pretty good word for a blue-collar kid from Buffalo, New York.
Yeah.
I was keeping notes. And what I really expected, Jay, was that at some point, sitting on a rocking chair in my old age, I'd go through all those notes just to stay close to my son.
Like somebody would read their journal.
A journal. That's really what I thought it was. But, like they say, the Greeks used to say that man plans and gods laugh.
Yeah.
So they had a plan, and the plan was that these notes were then going to be a book. So he crossed January 3rd, 2016, and in February of 2017, my brother-in-law was over, and he was downstairs with my wife, and they were talking about how tenacious Chris was when he was a kid, and 2 and 3 years old, playing hide and seek, and he would say, hide again, and then go hide. You'd find him, and he'd be right back at it. And at that moment, I said, I'm going to write a book, and I walked upstairs and started writing the book.
Wow.
As I got into the writing part and was moved by spirit, by Chris's spirit, I was told that this book had to be completed by Father's Day 2018, and it was completed 2 weeks before that.
Now, you mentioned your wife. Your wife is a social worker?
Yeah, my wife is a social worker therapist, right?
But how, most therapists are very traditional. So when people go to mediums and psychics and seances, social workers the social workers I know, many of them that will scratch their heads. So how is your wife with this?
Oh, my wife is absolutely on board with this. And I got to
Good.
tell you something. I'm a big fan of Wayne Dyer, and I loved his spiritual approach.
I've met him.
Did you really?
Oh,
Wow.
I'll tell you a story
I would love to
afterwards.
hear, because I absolutely, I think he took me to another level spiritually than I was on, even with my AA knowledge. But Wayne would say that, back in the day, you'd ask somebody about God, and they'd say, "Well, I don't believe in God because I'm a scientist." And now with all the scientific proof and everything that's coming through, they would say, "What do you think about God?" And they would say, "Of course there's a God. I'm a scientist," because the proof lines it up. So I would say those sciences, like social workers and therapists, that veil is so thin with them that I think you'd be surprised that most of those people have a leaning toward acceptance of the other side. Here's a number. 70% of people have had some sort of communication with the other side, whether it's a sign, a dream, a message, a visit, a medium visit. 70%. So that's a pretty big number. So I heard a quote from a guy.
And a lot of those contact with the other sides are life transforming or life saving.
Of course. I don't think they don't make this move to connect with us frivolously. And what I've kind of figured out, and believe me, I had very little knowledge walking in. So what I was pointed to figure out is that our energy level is pretty low. We cycle at a pretty low energy level, and the spirits cycle at a pretty high energy level. So we've got to raise our consciousness and energy level through meditation, prayer,
service,
anything that puts us on a higher plane, and they've got to lower theirs. They've got to slow themselves down to be able to connect with psychic, like spiritual slugs that we are.
Yeah, I agree.
They have to make the effort, and they do.
Okay, when you were meeting with the mediums after Chris' death, you kept good notes. Do you continue to refer to those notes?
No, it's funny. It's a great question, and I had them, and I kept them in chronological order. So when I was writing the book, I'd grab the notes with the dates, and go through them, put them in the book, put them back. And when I was reading those notes, many times it was like looking at them for the first time, because I hadn't looked at them in 6 months, 8 months, a year sometimes. And so it never left my office, which was Christopher's bedroom. And there's things called psychic imprints.
Did you change the bedroom around after Christopher?
Well, yeah. He had gone, then his little brother was in there, and then when his little brother's now a freshman in college, so I turned it into an office. And I love it because I still feel Christopher's energy moving around there very easily.
Because you've lost one child, do you have fears of losing another?
No. No, I don't. I don't think it goes that way. I think I honor every day more than I ever did before because of that. There's more likely that I'd drive up to Milwaukee to have dinner with my daughter who's at Marquette than maybe I would have before. But it's not. None of this is driven by fear.
Okay.
Yeah, none of it's driven by fear.
All right. Why don't you say something about the mediums you saw before Christopher died? And do you prefer to, when I talk about Christopher and his death, do you prefer that I say he died, he passed,
I want you to whatever you're comfortable with, because and to me, for anybody who gets hung up on anything like that, lighten up, Buttercup. You know what I mean? It's just a word, right?
Yeah.
So I don't use the word died a lot. I'll use crossed, passed,
transition,
whatever. Transition's a good one.
Yeah.
But sometimes you sound a little new agey when you do that. So I try to keep it light.
Okay, so talk about the medium. You had experience with the mediums before Christopher made his transition.
There were two experiences I had. One was an absolute experience on a lark. And when I was single and young and wild, I was living in D.C. My sister Marcia, my favorite sister, who was Christopher's godmother, she was living in D.C. And we were walking around on a Saturday afternoon, and just after lunch, decided to go see medium. So we went up, and, I was nervous as all get out, and I didn't know what to expect. And she told me, and I don't know if it was medium or tarot cards, but it was something along, and she said, you have a girlfriend here now, and she's surrounded by water. She's with a girl that's not a nice girl, and it's not going to work out. Now, that's pretty specific. And at the time, my girlfriend family had a place in Cape Cod, so it was surrounded on 3 sides. She said 3 sides by water. And when we got back, it didn't work out. Now, I don't think it was the gods intervening. I think I was a terrible boyfriend, and she was smart to get out early at that point.
Yeah.
And then she told my sister, who was a divorced mother of 2, in her 40s, that she was going to have 12 children. And my sister blew it off.
So 10 more children than she currently
and she's in her 40s, and
Yeah.
she has no intention. So her and I were walking down the street toward DuPont Circle, and she said, I don't know what, it was absolutely nothing connected. And she said, they told me I was going to have 12 kids. We weren't in each other's readings, right? And I said, wow, that's crazy. I said, the guy you're dating, that widower, Tom, how many kids he have? She said 10. So, although she didn't adopt those kids, she became a mother after they married.
Yeah.
They married a couple years later, and she became a mother to all of them. So as crazy as that sounds, that's something we still made reference to. So, and that was it. That was a lark. That would be like going to instead of going to the Smithsonian or Art Institute, we tried this. But then years later, fast forward 15 years probably about 2000, before Christopher crossed over. And I was just getting interested in, I'd always had a little bit of interest in this. And so I got a name from somebody who referred somebody, and her name was Nancine. And she was in the western suburbs, maybe Arlington Heights, I'm not sure. But I went and saw her, and most of the reading was pretty bland. And the reason it was there was no need, I had no real need to connect. My parents were gone, but they were gone in a normal order of time. They had done a great job. I adored my parents. So at the end of the reading, and I'm kind of like looking at my watch going like, yeah, tick-tock, gotta go. And she said, your dad's here. And I said, oh, great. And she said, he's showing me a caboose and telling you railroad so you know it's him. Now, this is 2000. There wasn't Google searches, and my old man wasn't anybody famous. He's 40 years on the railroad. We had 5 boys in our family. 5 boys in our family. We all worked on the railroad during school.
And what were you in the order?
I was youngest of 10. So I was the baby.
And she said caboose, and
Yeah,
caboose is the last one.
But I got to tell you, I've actually spent, when I worked on the railroad as a kid, my dad had a lot of seniority, 40 years on the railroad. I had actually spent time on a caboose working with my dad, which I just felt honored to be. This guy's was a railroader. In my office, I have a railroad lantern, right? Because that's who we were. If you're back when I grew up, if you were a coach's kid, the whole culture of the family was coach. If your dad was a teacher, it was a teacher's family. In our case, we were railroaders. And so she said, and that was the only thing. And Dad didn't go into anything extravagant, but I knew that something was there, something was real.
Yeah.
And so I just filed it away and got on with my life. And 15 years later, I reached out to that same woman, Nancine.
Okay, you're watching Inner Quest, and we're with Joe McQuillen. And Joe is talking about his son who's crossed over, and he's written a book about his visits to psychics, mediums, other forms of healers. We're sponsored by Infinity Foundation. Please support Infinity. There's all sorts of classes from young children to older adults, and there's a lot to learn. Interesting people like Joe. So now, after your son crossed over,
Yep.
when was your first visit? How soon after?
Very soon. The week, a couple of days after he crossed, I reached out, and that woman from Arlington Heights, Nancine, had moved to Arizona long time ago. But I had her number, and I called her, and she actually said, look, it's okay. He's crossed over. He crossed over successfully. He didn't feel it. He felt the shock of, and this is painful, the shock of the lungs. But then it was like passing out. I mean, the good news and bad news is they wouldn't have made a decision to do this recklessly if they weren't under the influence, but that also helped them transition painlessly. It was like passing out.
And was it cold that night? Because it was January.
It was January in Wisconsin, Lake Beulah, and there were a dozen of them, and they were at a local pub shooting pool. One of the young men's family had a lake house, and that was at his disposal. So they were all just spending the night there. And to be honest with you, my wife and I thought, gee, isn't this a lot better than being on the streets of Chicago? It's not dangerous. They're going to be in this environment. Well,
so you actually discussed
Yeah.
your son Chris' safety before?
Yeah. Well, you know what? He was a reckless kid. We discussed his safety a lot, and it was hard for us. And so they went up there and they went outside and were walking around and saw a boathouse. The kid's family had a boathouse, and they had some canoes, and somebody said, "Let's go for a ride." And 4 of them jumped in a 3-man canoe and didn't take any life preservers, and left their phones all on the dock so they couldn't get lost. And you know, in the morning, the kids were looking for them, couldn't find them.
Have you ever visited
Yeah.
this lake at night when it was dark? To
No,
see?
I went back out. It was during the day. It was hard enough to do that, but I was out in that area on business, and I just kept going, and I visited it.
So that takeaway from that first medium, what was it?
Well, the takeaway was that it was real. He was communicating with me. He was horribly sorry that he caused this kind of pain. Turns out things I've learned subsequently, exit points. He had a couple before. He had a couple near-death experiences. Well, one, he fell down a 30-foot mine shaft while hiking in Havasupai.
He survived a 30-foot fall?
Yeah.
How was he rescued?
Airlifted out, and they pulled him out with a harness, and then took a helicopter up to the point where I was driving up to Wisconsin that January 3rd. That was the longest period of time in my life. I got a call from the ranch and said, you know, he was working as a life coach, and the leader who had been an Air Force Ranger, you know, just made a bad call and said, let's go into these caves and look around, and it was a mine shaft and an air shaft next to it, and they're unmarked. It was in the Indian Territory in Havasupai, and fell down. And actually, it was 100 feet. He landed on a ledge 30 feet down.
Did he break any bones?
Broke a lot. He broke collar, arm was in, you know, the bone was in half, foot. So they airlifted him, and they said, look, we don't know what's going on, but if he's going to Las Vegas, it's because they're worried about paralysis. And if they're taking him to Flagstaff, they're not worried about paralysis. They're just going to, you know, get him there. So they called and said Flagstaff, and I was very grateful. And a friend of mine, a dear kid, Mike Sawyer, who's like a little brother to me, lived in Scottsdale, and Chris called both his godfather and this guy, Uncle Mike, and Uncle Mike drove up with his family, and he said the hospital was like a MASH unit, so he said, look, I'm signing the kid out. And the doctor said, you don't have authority to sign him out. And he said, this kid's coming with me one way or the other. And there were a couple of ranch kids with him. And they got him down to Scottsdale Osborne, where they put him together. And he stayed with them until I got there the next day.
When they signed him out, they didn't just drive him in a car. Did they take an ambulance?
In a car. There was no ambulance. They didn't even have gurneys available. They were going to let him go with his arm in half. And so my buddy had been working in sports management in Arizona, got him to the finest hospital in Arizona.
Did Chris talk about that near-death experience much?
You know what? I wish I knew, Jay, what I know now, because I would have gotten him some therapy for the trauma, PSTD, which he had.
Did he suffer a concussion as well?
Oh yeah, he was pretty banged up. I mean, we brought him home for a couple months, and I stayed with him for that week in Arizona. Then we flew him home, and then we set up the dining room and turned it into a bedroom for him. And you know, I'd give him a shot every day for the thinning, the blood thinning, and he healed. But Patrick Barassa, who owns the ranch, actually called and said, "Look, let me get him some trauma therapy." And I thought, okay. I said, hey, Chris, Patrick wants to get you something. He goes, I don't need that. And I accepted that. And that haunts me, to be honest with you, Jay.
Yeah.
I wish I would have done something a little more.
He must have been in that mine shaft for quite some time.
He was there
before,
for 5 or 6 hours. He was
and it's probably dark inside?
going into shock, and he talked about a guy in the mine shaft on the ledge with him, and there wasn't one.
Yes.
They sent down a harness that he put on. Nobody was there in the mine shaft. So it
must have been painful to put on the harness
Yep.
and be lifted up 30
and
feet.
in going into shock. But we
Yeah.
believe sincerely to this day that there was an angel with him. And
I
that's when
believe that too.
When he's making reference to a guy dressed in white who was there. Didn't know enough to go any deeper into it, Jay. I don't, there's a lot of what ifs. Every parent who lost a kid thinks about every bad decision they made as a parent, or every harsh word you say as a parent, and that's one of them. That's one of the mistakes I would like to redo at some point, maybe in another life.
Yeah, and have you communicated with Chris, and has he forgiven you?
Yeah. In fact, I communicate with Chris all the time, and he's completely blown it off, and it was just the way it is, and that's who he was. He was reckless, and that I didn't make any bad decisions, and he's fine with it. It's my Catholic guilt haunting me, not his.
Now, you mentioned that Chris had multiple near-death experiences?
Yeah. We sent him out when he turned 18, and he was living in Tucson, but they work like firemen when they work at the ranch. So it's an hour and a half south of Tucson, so they would go down there and spend 3 days on, where they'd spend the night, 2 days on and 3 days off, and then they'd go home. And so he was catching rides. So on the 18th birthday, I surprised him and sent out an S10 pickup on a transport carrier. And one day at 6 o'clock in the morning, late for the ranch, and there's 2 miles of ridiculous road going to the ranch, ruts, holes, and if it's not summer, they tell you if you're coming to visit, you have to have an SUV. Mm-hmm. So driving too fast, S10 pickup's pretty light, flipped it, smashed on the roof, walked away without a scratch.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Did he talk about that experience?
Yeah, he talked about that one.
Yeah. Well, we have under 2 minutes, but hopefully we can do a second interview.
Love to.
So you went to the medium. You stuck. Did you do any other mediums besides that one you initially met around here?
Yes. What happened is, and she had moved, and so although I had contacted her a number of times, and I'm just holding on at this point. It was a month after he left, or 2 months.
Were you able to work in that period?
Oh yeah. I've got a wife and 2 kids to support. So, yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, he was buried on a Friday. I was back to work on a Monday. And we all grieve differently, and that's how my grief was: throw as much activity as you can, and then when the tsunami of grief hits you, you just let it come and you deal with it, and then you get back on the saddle. But that's how I grieve. It doesn't make it right.
Yeah. Was there any thought of using alcohol at that point?
Great question. No, I wanted to run away. I wanted to grab my Labrador, my golf clubs, and head to Key West, but never thought of alcohol.
Well, I'm getting the sign to wrap up. For more information about Joe, his son Christopher, Infinity Foundation, or InnerQuest, please stay tuned to the credits at the end. Until next time, wish you good health, good fortune, and good spirits. Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
For more information about this show, our guest, Infinity Foundation, or any of our other programs, please visit our website, infinityfoundation.org, or call us at 847-831-8828.